Once again, we're here to accomplish the second part of our dual mission. The first part, of course, being to support undergraduate students from the University of California as they become our future leaders. And the second is to share knowledge that's produced on our campuses and national laboratories in the interest of better public policymaking. Today's talk fits into one of our three annual themes, this one being drought, fires, and flooding. And although we've had a short respite due to reasonably good rainy seasons the past 2 years, fire has always been a part of life in California. And as we've learned in previous talks, mega fires are becoming increasingly common. I'm excited about this talk, not only because of the two speakers, and I'll say a bit about them later, but also because my own lifetime of work in health services research has taught me if you don't measure all of the important outcomes that are related to a treatment, an intervention, or a problem, you're going to miss something important. And this is as true for the impacts of fire as it is for the implementation of Obamacare, say. So our speakers today have broad experience both in academia and in the larger world. Ken Alex is a lawyer who worked for 7 years as senior policy advisor and director of the Governor's Office of Planning and Research in the Brown administration. Currently, he's director of Project Climate at UC Berkeley, the Center for Law, Energy, and the Environment. He's been called the most influential environmental lawyer in California in the past 20 years. He's a graduate of UC Santa Cruz and Harvard Law and spent over 35 years in state service before retreating to the maybe not so quiet space of UC Berkeley. Leanna Weisberg is California Director for American Forests, an organization founded in 1875 and dedicated to creating healthy forests from coast to coast and building a reforestation movement in America. Before that, she was a research fellow at CLE, Berkeley, and a forester with the Bureau of Land Management. Ms. Weisberg holds a master's degree in forestry from Yale. So please join me in welcoming our two guests. We'll start first with Ms. Weisberg and then move on to Mr. Allen. Thank you.
Hey, hi everybody. Thanks for inviting me to be here today. Excited to speak with all of you. And thank you for the introduction. My name is Leanna Weisberg. I'm speaking today on behalf of UC Berkeley Center for Law, Energy, and the Environment and the Climate and Wildfire Institute about the California Zero and Fire Project. So the purpose of the California Zero and Fire Project is really to create a framework that can more comprehensively account for the impacts of wildfire across the state of California on both social and ecological systems. The project is intended to help us understand how these impacts are trending and identify areas where we may need additional investment to really mitigate the worst of wildfire impacts. As was stated, you know, the impetus here or the guiding principle is sort of what gets measured gets managed. So much of our current framework around assessing wildfire impacts primarily rests on how many acres have burned in a given year. So the idea is to really expand the scope on that. I'm going to talk a little bit about the framework itself and what's included and what we're measuring and why. So the intent of the project, as I said, is to reflect both social and is that working? Okay. In order to serve multiple audiences, so to serve policymakers, but also interested and affected individuals. Interesting. I don't appear to be, okay, there we go. The project would also aggregate and synthesize wide-ranging data sets to kind of, as I say, sort of provide that comprehensive view of wildfire impacts and kind of create greater meaning by bringing disparate data sets into conversation with one another. And then would contextualize those data, those annual figures, using benchmarks and trend analyses to sort of situate annual statistics in terms of forward-looking goals or historic norms, since we know that there can be a lot of interannual variability with fire statistics. So I'm going to go through the aspects of this framework, as I say, what we're measuring and why. The intent of this project is would ultimately be to host this data on a public-facing website that's updated annually and provides that, data at different scales for all the different metrics that we'll talk through. So that's kind of the forward-looking goal for this project. So the California Year in Fire project is organized into 5 questions, each of which kind of gets at a different dimension of wildfire impacts. And each of those questions then has several metrics tiered to it, which, as I say, would be updated annually and reflected at different scales. So I'm going to walk through the 5 questions and all of the metrics that are tiered to those questions, and then we'll kind of take a deeper dive per question. So question 1 is, how is wildfire impacting landscapes? And we're going to look on this slide at all of the metrics that are tiered to that question. And just to orient folks a bit, the bar graphics that you're seeing here will be represented for each question. This is how we're representing data at this point on that annual basis. And for each metric, you're seeing the 2021 figure kind of highlighted because that was the focal year of this iteration and report that was recently published, although the report does also compare some 2022 figures were available to 2021 values. So those are the figures that are sort of bolded in each graphic, and you're seeing where 2021 lies as it compares with the minimum value for the period of record for that metric. And the maximum value, and of course the period of record is different for each metric. And then in some cases you'll also see benchmarks. So on that lower row there are a few metrics which have benchmarks, which is kind of might be a median or some other way to display a normative value to kind of help us understand how deviated any given year is. So the metrics that are tiered to question 1 are acres burned. We can't really quite get away from that metric, but we're trying to bring more color. So it's stratified in several ways by fire cause and by vegetation type, for example. We're also looking at model estimated emissions and model debris flow hazard in this question. The next question is, how is wildfire impacting ecological resilience? And here the metrics of interest are fire severity, area and large high severity patches, areas that might be high priority for reforestation where we don't suspect natural regen will occur, fire return interval departure, how deviated are we from a normative fire return interval, and a metric that's specific to shrubland resilience in Southern California, where as we spoke about upstairs before this session, a lot of the wildfire risks are or impacts are associated with overly abundant fire. Question 3 is, what are the social impacts of wildfire? And there are several metrics that correspond to this question, including total and insured economic losses from wildfire, structure impacts. And again, we're kind of trying to stratify and bring some color to that by looking specifically at residential structures that are impacted, or structures which were built after 2008 with the passage of Chapter 7A. And also looking at fatalities, impacts of public safety power shutoff events, and how those affect vulnerable populations in particular, as well as evacuations. Question 4 is, what is the cost of wildfire response and recovery? And here we're looking at fire suppression costs, how we utilize personnel. So how many personnel are needed to respond to wildfire incidents, how many incident management teams are needed to respond to complex incidents, how frequently are state or federal emergency proclamations made in response to incidents, as well as state cleanup costs for things like hazardous debris removal or hazard tree removal. And the last question, question 5, is how are we addressing wildfire risk? So what are we doing that's proactive that might be mitigating some of these impacts? These metrics include acres treated with prescribed fire. We have some metrics that basically communicate how often conditions are, how often prescribed fire is permissible based on per CARB and local air districts. How often we are capitalizing on those days where burning is permissible. So comparing how often prescribed fire is happening, or comparing, looking at what proportion of those permissible days are we actually burning. This also includes fire-wise communities and defensible space inspections, compliance rates that are conducted by CAL FIRE on private lands. So as you can see, large suite of metrics that kind of runs the gamut. A lot of these metrics are selected based on data availability, how quickly data are updated or how reliably data are updated, what the period of record might be, public access, etc. So I think there is a whole universe of information that we might consider, some of which is more qualitative. We've also talked about metrics that could be included with more robust data analysis. So I'll talk a little bit more about that later, but just to give you all a sense of kind of how we arrived at these metrics, which are certainly a first pass and open to refinement. So as I said, I'm going to dive a little bit more into look at one metric per question, and just kind of talk a little bit more about implications, trends that we're seeing, how that kind of public-facing website might allow us to make a little bit more meaning. So question 1, as I said, we can't quite get away from acres burned, but I think it's like a good place to start, just for this format. So again, on the left, you're seeing that graphic, which situates the 2021 value throughout the period of record. In 2021, we had about 2.5 million acres burned across the state of California, which was second only in annual acreage burn to 2020, which was 4.2. And you can see on the graph to the right, you know, how significant those figures are as outliers over the period of record, which in this case goes back to 1950. These data are from the CAL FIRE Fire Perimeters database. So that database actually goes back to the 19th century, but 1950 is kind of considered a point at which those data become especially reliable. So that's what we've looked at here. And I suppose notably, I'll say that we're going to look at a few metrics which don't display a benchmark. And then as we kind of move through the questions, there are some metrics that do incorporate benchmarks. Acres burned is one that we have decided should really be benchmarked with consideration for vegetation type and fire regime and fire severity, and not necessarily as like just a median value over the period of record, because there's so much variability in what we might consider normative, or so many variables that inform what we might consider normative here. But clearly, pretty significant increase over this period of record. Question number 2, how is wildfire impacting ecological resilience? So the purpose of this question is really to look not just at how many acres burn, but how they burn. So the metric that we're highlighting here is area in large high severity patches, and these are defined as patches that are or areas that are 120 meters from patch edge. So that's, you know, what this picture here is trying to represent are areas that are essentially disconnected from the rest of the landscape because from areas that may have burned at low or moderate severity or not have burned at all. the implications of which are, what type of vegetation might establish there post-fire, at what severity might they burn if they reburn, as well as other environmental effects like carbon and water storage potential or wildlife habitat connectivity. So a lot of implications here. We can see that kind of trend analysis over time. Again, 2021 appears to be a very high value when considering the period of record, which goes back to 1985 in this case. 2021 is also a very significant outlier here. One of a way in which a public-facing website with like a spatial element would certainly add color here is our ability to spatially represent where these patches are occurring, how many of them are overlapping over time, how contiguous they are, statistics around size, etc. So there are a lot of ways that we could look at this and a lot of ways that we could derive additional meaning with that user interface and spatial element. So going back to social impacts of wildfire, the metric that we're highlighting here is sort of a paired metric, total and insured economic losses from wildfire, which we're kind of considering in tandem. There are actually, in this case, several years with, this is one metric in which 2021 is not the highest or even second highest value. So 2017 with Napa fires and 2018 with the Camp Fire are kind of our highest values over the period of record. That top line shows total economic losses, and that kind of teal bottom line, which tracks it closely, is total insured losses. So I think an important point to note for this data in particular is the gap between the two, which in some years can be very significant. In 2017, it's about $10 billion. So there are a lot of social implications about the where of those gaps and the magnitude of those gaps. I also just want to take a minute to kind of highlight some relatively new data that could be incorporated into this question around social impacts. A lot of the sort of impetus for this project was around capturing public health impacts of wildfire, which can be challenging to reflect due to relative paucity of air monitors and systematic measurements, et cetera. So this data was provided to us by collaborators at Cornell Public Health, and it's all modeled data using relatively standard approaches to modeling public health impacts from wildfire smoke, which is somewhat of a new area. But these are data which were not included in our recent report, but which we would look to include in future iterations. So these are preliminary data that are presented on an annual basis using daily data points and represented per county. So there are two additional graphics I'll show on the next slide. But we're looking here at mean wildfire smoke concentrations per county in 2021 on a county basis, estimated number of deaths associated with wildfire, estimated percent of deaths due to wildfire smoke, and estimated economic impact. So Cornell, our collaborator at Cornell, will be launching like a public interface and data and publications regarding this in, I think they're targeting late May, and will be producing data going back to 2013 and providing for pretty quick updates to their platform. So really interested to see how that might intersect with this project in the future. Question 4 is, what's the cost of wildfire response and recovery, going back to kind of metrics that we have already included. This one is personnel assigned to wildfire incidents. So these are wildland fire personnel associated with crews, engines, helicopters, and overhead. And again, these are annual statistics. So 2020, not surprisingly, is the maximum value, but 2021 is not too far behind, both over 1 million personnel days. So these are not individual people, but people days. So one person might be counted several times over that year. And this is one that, as I said, includes a benchmark, which is represented on the graphic to the left with that triple line, and on the graph is a dotted line, and that's a median over the period of record, which in this case is not terribly long, but provides us somewhat of a greater sense of what we might consider normative here. And in this case, that value is over 700,000. So 2021 is exceeding it by almost 50%. So, and the last question we'll kind of deep dive on is how are we addressing wildfire risk, and looking here at acres treated with prescribed fire. So I want to acknowledge before heading into this metric that prescribed fire is not the most appropriate or only management action that we might take to mitigate fire risk, depending on vegetation type and condition of existing stands, et cetera. This question, I think, is one that's can be particularly challenging to address in a way that is truly comprehensive, and I think would ultimately involve incorporating more qualitative information, which I'll talk more about in a little bit, but it is a dimension which is of import that should be considered. So again, these data are from the CAL FIRE Fire Perimeters database, and we're just looking at 1950 to present. 2019 is actually the maximum value over this period of record at 118,000. 2021 fell behind at 75,000, but you know, this metric obviously has a little bit more variability and is very contingent upon conditions and workforce availability, et cetera. But you know, there are ties here with the state's goals around prescribed fire acreage that you know, we would need to increase these annual values to meet. So those are all the metrics and questions and deep dives that I have for today. So I just want to talk a little bit before wrapping up about kind of challenges and possibilities for this project as it moves into future phases. So the first, which I think is very important, is to increase regional and ecological specificity. I kind of alluded to this, but there are, you know, California is a big state. There are a lot of different vegetation types and a lot of fire regimes. And while there are some metrics that would be useful to represent at a state summary level, a lot of these metrics really need to be reported at a smaller spatial scale to have the most meaning. So we are aware of that. There are, you know, several of these metrics like fire severity or acres burned, where there are proposed benchmarks or proposed means of representing that data that aligns more with fire regimes, but which we have not yet gotten to incorporate just due to data analysis capacity. So another is to incorporate qualitative information, as I said, and kind of elevate solutions. So one of the ideas that's come up around a public-facing website is the ability to every year when it's updated, maybe spotlight a wildfire incident that occurred 5 to 10 years prior, which was really notable in the year that it occurred, and highlight solutions, community-based or otherwise, that might really be having an impact, but which we might not capture systematically through the data sets that are included here. Another is to include newly available data sets like the wildfire smoke impacts, for example. We've also included treatment acres in the report, which is newly available via the California Wildfire and Forest Resilience Task Force. So always new data to incorporate. And then, as I said before, statistical analysis. So kind of refining those benchmarks, making them more ecologically and regionally specific. Also including metrics like we've talked about impacts to vulnerable communities, for example, which will require a little bit more intensive data analysis capacity than we've had, and as well as looking at, which metrics are correlated and how might we pare down this set of metrics but still have create the same meaning. And then that regularly updated user interface that will allow us to incorporate a spatial component and increase applicability and accessibility. And that's it for me. So thank you so much for having me. I'll turn it over to Ken.
Okay, they have the
Yeah.
the barrier. I can't see everybody, but nice to see those of you who I can see. Thank you so much for inviting us. I do want to thank the Climate and Wildfire Institute and the Moore Foundation that provided funding for this work. And I also want to really acknowledge Leanna's work. She conceived of this and she created it. All of the metrics and everything that you just saw and everything that's in the report was the creation of Leanna's efforts and talking to many experts, but she really put this thing together. So as usual, as the kind of policy person, I come in later and hopefully take advantage of the great work. Let's see here. The report itself is quite extensive. If you want to download it, the QR code is here, and there's one outside on the desk as well. It's also on the website of the Climate and Wildfire Institute and of CLE, the Center for Law, Energy, and Environment. And I encourage you to do so if you're interested. There's huge amounts of data and a lot more graphs and charts than we have time to present here. This is a very ambitious idea and project. The idea is how do we take data and information across multiple metrics and turn them into ways to make better policy, to make better decisions, to allow better preparation, to make better decisions at a land use level. We're spending billions and billions of dollars in California on wildfire response, on wildfire resilience, and all aspects related to people and communities that live in the wildland-urban interface. And yet, we do not measure it well on a consistent basis to see what's working, to see what policies are meaningful, to see where we're failing. And so this is an effort to try to help with that set of problems. Let's see here. So I think there's almost endless things we can learn from the data depending on how people want to use it. And I just want to talk about a little bit of that. As we've said quite a few times, it's not just about acres burned. When we talked about this, Leanna and I talked about this project and what it might incorporate, we were extremely interested in the idea of resilience, both the ecological resilience and community resilience, and how we get at measurements and metrics that allow us to, over time, have a concept of what those possibilities are. And second, health impacts. The thing about wildfire, in no small part, is that it affects almost every person certainly in the state and really in the country. Last year with the Canadian wildfires, or this year with the Canadian wildfires, New York City was under health advisories for air emissions. And then how do we set priorities for where we're going to spend the billions of dollars? so far, it's somewhat ad hoc, and we would like to see that improved. So I'll just go through a couple of examples to talk about how we might think a little bit differently based on some of these metrics and how we might expand the metrics. So we're reading daily now about insurance companies that are reducing coverage. There are various different explanations for that, and some of them are ending up in reduced coverage in some surprising areas of the state. Some of them are obvious, that you might say, okay, these are high fire areas or high fire risk areas. Some of them are not. And I think it's important for us and for policymakers to understand exactly where and why insurance coverage is being struck out or costing a huge amount of money. We can add all kinds of metrics to this. How many inspections were done by local governments around communities, around buildings, around houses to identify issues of fire threat and fire risk? How much hardening has been done for buildings and houses, and how does that impact fire resilience? Prescribed burns, as Leanna said, is a very complicated metric, but there are all kinds of aspects that we can identify. Not only do we know the number of prescribed fires and the number of prescribed acres, but we can learn quite a bit more about what the relationship of those prescribed burns is to reducing fire risk. Right now, there's the Climate and Wildfire Institute is part of perhaps the largest prescribed burn treatment area in California to learn more about how forest land responds to that kind of treatment. And one thing that's fairly fascinating to me is that if you treat one area, apparently it can have an impact on a much wider area, including parts that were not treated with prescribed burn. That kind of thing can be captured in some of this data. Low impact burn areas, I think, are quite interesting. So we think now that we're in a different fire regime, this idea of truly scorched earth, where fires burn so hot that the soil itself is impacted in a way that really reduces ability to grow. Not all acres burned in California are subject to that high impact. And in fact, some of the fires burned through natural fire process are low impact and have the desired outcome that we would seek if we were actually treating those areas. And so that needs to be captured as well as simply more nuanced than looking at acres burned. All right. Next example is health impacts. The obvious is CO2 emissions, which we do have started in California to capture. Until a couple of years ago, CO2 emissions from wildfire were not considered part of California's CO2 emissions overall, which is somewhat concerning given that CO2 emissions from wildfire can actually overwhelm the entire CO2 emission system, and almost equivalent to the total amount of California's CO2 emissions from other sources. So we need to ensure that those are part of the calculus. PM 2.5 is particularly of interest because it turns out that smoke emitted from wildfire and the PM 2.5 pollution from wildfire is seen as more toxic than other sources, even from cars, because of the way the burning takes place and the combustion and what it produces. So we need to know more about that. And then there are many other measures, and I think we need to look at what actions are taken to protect health So things like filtration, school day limitations, notices and emergency requirements to keep people indoors, things like that. My center, the Center for Law, Energy, Environment, is going to be issuing a report, I think next week, hopefully by the end of the month at the latest, on scoping air pollution issues and the kinds of things that we need to be looking at for health and air pollution impacts from wildfire. And I think that's going to be an area of growing interest and concern. Having metrics that allow us to really consider what those impacts will be is very important. All right. So some implications. You can imagine quite a few. I just want to go through a couple of these that I think are particularly important for policymakers and decision makers. Treatment priorities are a big set of issues for the state of California. That's where a lot of money is being spent. Well, what is the impact of treatments? Where is it working? Where is it not working? We know from 2 years ago's fire in the Tahoe area, the Tahoe Basin, that actually some of the treatments in that area were quite effective. And had they not had those areas treated, the fires might have gone into the basin itself. So what can we learn from that, and how can we reflect that in metrics like this? Insurance reform is an obvious one. How many houses now and residences are needing to go to the FAIR plan? How many residences are not insured? And what are the implications of having maybe thousands of houses in WUIs and wildland urban interfaces that are actually not insured? That has very significant impacts for the state of California. All right, see if there's any of the others that I want to talk about. Actions by land managers. The state is spending quite a lot of time and money and energy in conjunction with the federal government, working on regional resource kits, as they're called, RRKs, looking at how land managers may best understand in the 4 separate fire regime regions that have been identified for California, what are the best sets of priorities to take? And we think that those regional resource kits and the actions land managers need to take can be best, can be really benefited by some of these metrics. The other thing that I think we'd really like to do with this project is to tie it to mapping. So right now it's a little bit abstract, some of the metrics, but if we can map a lot more of this and tie it to the metrics themselves, I think the implications will be a lot more clear. And so just wrapping up, the usual problem here is it's hard to fund this work, and we're trying to figure out what to do next. So some of it is fairly easy to measure and therefore fairly easy to update. So CAL FIRE, as you saw, keeps some of this data that's obviously very available. But the more sophisticated, more nuanced, more detailed sets of metrics need some additional analytics. The work that Leanne identified at Cornell is really interesting, and we want to see that continue, and we want to continue to integrate that. And there are many more sorts of pieces of data that we think could be really beneficial here for policymakers and for the public. And actually, we encourage you all to let us know what you think would be interesting and helpful as we go forward and think about what kinds of metrics would be really valuable for us to identify. And we'd like to eventually have a very public-facing website I think that it's something the Climate and Wildfire Institute would be quite interested in sponsoring over time. They funded a lot of this work, and they're set up to do things like this. And so we're going to try to figure out if there's a way to fund that through the Climate and Wildfire Institute. But I encourage everybody to help us think through what would be the most valuable and interesting ways to capture this information. And I think with that, I'll stop and we'll turn to questions. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much for that. We are going to go ahead for our Q&A portion. We're going to bounce back between them for